Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 7581.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to be the lead sponsor of H.R. 7581, the Improving Law Enforcement Officer Safety and Wellness Through Data Act, and I rise in support of it. The bill would refine and expand the gathering and analysis of data about attacks on law enforcement officers across the country, our current day scourge. Its sponsorship is bipartisan and bicameral. I'm grateful for the leadership in the Senate of Senators Grassley, Tillis, and others, and the support of 25 bipartisan co-sponsors in the House. The justification, Mr. Speaker, is obvious. Just yesterday, the FBI forecast the release of its annual report on officers assaulted and feloniously killed in the line of duty in 2023, reporting that, quote, from 2021 to 2023, more officers were feloniously killed, 194, than in any other consecutive 3-year period in the past 20 years. And 2024 is on track to be the worst year of any other than 2021 because a repeat criminal who should have been in jail gunned down 4 heroes in Charlotte 2 weeks ago and injured 5 others. Criminals killed 10 cops nationwide in April alone. Until the full 2023 report is released, the latest data are that over 66,000 officers were assaulted in 2022. This bill will deepen the available data set in 3 ways: reporting on the intentionality of targeting law enforcement officers because of their status as sworn officers, tracking aggression and trauma-inducing incidents that do not rise to crime, and cataloging the availability to officers of mental health resources to deal with the attacks they suffer. One would expect unanimous support, and yet in the Judiciary Committee, Democrats amazingly sought to gut and replace the entire bill with the same old anti-police legislation to impair qualified immunity for police officers, create a national registry of police misconduct, and require implicit bias, training, and so forth. If reacting to unprecedented killings and assaults of cops by intimidating and undermining cops sounds backwards and astonishing to you, watch the vote on this bill. The truth is that the strong impulse and desire among Democrats to demonize and delegitimize police remain powerful and just under the surface, even as many of them deny they ever uttered the words defund and abolish during the 2020 Summer of Love, which spawned mass riots and increased attacks and killings of not only police officers, but also those most in need of their protection. Especially here in Washington, D.C., the effects of this most irresponsible rhetoric in the history of American politics have been catastrophic. Crime remains out of control, especially among juveniles. Carjackings and assaults on congressmen, a 20-year murder record. Congress has disapproved, with Joe Biden's signature, the D.C. Council's radical rewrite of the district's criminal law that eliminated mandatory minimums, cut maximum sentences for most crimes. The D.C. Council members, 2 D.C. Council members face recall efforts by citizens beset by violent crime. And the Metropolitan Police Department has lost almost 600 of its 4,000 member force, and almost every month loses more than it hires. And yet, some Democrats will vote against this little bill to collect more information about attacks on officers. And it must be considered under a rule because it might not get the 2/3 majority required to pass on suspension, as many such little bills are. Here are the searing consequences. Where's that board? Right here. Here, to my right, are the searing consequences of this unforgivable political division. The human cost of the worst attack on law enforcement since 2016. Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department Officer Joshua Iyer North Carolina corrections officers Sam Pelosi and Alden Elliott, and Thomas Weeks Jr., United States Deputy Marshal, all lost their lives on April 29. I've been to their funerals. I've seen and heard from their families. May their names long endure in our memory. Or one could list the other lives taken from us longer ago, but just as strong in our memories. Jonathan Diller, NYPD officer, shot and killed in March during a traffic stop, leaving behind a wife and a 1-year-old son. Philip Dale Nix, Greensboro police sergeant, killed at a Sheetz gas station, interdicting criminals who wanted to steal mass quantities of beer the night before New Year's Eve. Ned Byrd, Wake County, North Carolina sheriff's deputy, ambushed and shot to death by illegals in 2022. Ryan Hendricks, Henderson County, North Carolina deputy, lost his life in a shootout with a hardened criminal wanted in multiple states. David Dorn, 77-year-old retired police captain, fatally shot, interrupting a burglary in St. Louis during the George Floyd riots in 2020. And far, far too many others to name in the time allowed. Is it time yet to come around? The former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton said about that place, quote, "Don't hold your breath. The state and the city council have been captured by the progressive left, and it's unlikely that the voters are going to take them out of office anytime soon." Let's prove that the same cannot be said of Congress, one way or the other. Support our men and women in blue. The American people certainly do, the overwhelming majority of them. Let's pass this little bill, develop the information necessary so that we can protect the officers who serve us, who risk their lives every day. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague across the aisle just mischaracterized the Democratic amendment that was offered during committee, and I think if he went back and looked at the record, he would see that. Mr. Speaker, this legislation purports to improve law enforcement officer safety and wellness. It seeks to do this by requiring the Attorney General and other federal officials to issue reports about attacks on officers, aggression against officers, and officer mental health. While this legislation may seem on the surface to be meaningful, let us be really clear. It is just more cheap talk from Republicans. Absolutely nothing in this bill makes a single police officer safer or invests a single dollar in officer wellness. While the collection of accurate data, including data on officer attacks and mental health, is important, this bill is unlikely to provide any new or meaningful data. By necessity, data about incidents of violence against law enforcement officers must already be initially collected and reported, if at all, by tribal, state, and local authorities who are in the best position to know about these incidents, not the Attorney General. The federal government collects this data through the participation by these authorities in voluntary data reporting programs like the National Incident-Based Reporting Program and the Law Enforcement Officers Killed and Assaulted Data Collection. But nothing in this bill provides any resources for more agencies to participate in these data collection programs, nor does it mandate any kind of reporting. Given that there is nothing in this bill to improve the underlying data that is available to the Attorney General and others, it is unlikely that the reporting required by the bill would be able to deliver any new insights that might actually improve officer safety. Democrats sought to solve this basic problem of inadequate data collection through the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Under that bill, states would be required to report shootings, deaths, and other uses of force involving law enforcement officers, and states would receive grants to facilitate that reporting. By both mandating and supporting data collection and reporting, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act would significantly improve the data available to the Congress, federal agencies, and the public. Critically, unlike this legislation, that bill would require reporting of uses of force both by and against law enforcement, enabling us to have a full understanding of the dangers faced by officers as well as the injuries and deaths of civilians that are caused by police. In focusing only on attacks against officers, this bill turns a blind eye to uses of force by law enforcement against civilians, whether it is justified or not. The mental health reporting provisions of the bill are also unlikely to improve officer wellness because they fail to build on the work of past Congresses and the Biden administration. In the 115th Congress, we passed the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act, a bipartisan bill signed into law by President Obama, which directed the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and DOJ's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services to report on mental health practices and services that could be adopted by law enforcement and the programs already available to them. It also expanded the availability of grant funds for law enforcement mental health and developed new educational resources. Building on this work, President Biden issued a 2022 executive order on advancing effective, accountable policing and criminal justice practices to enhance public trust and public safety. The executive order required the Attorney General to develop and publish a report on best practices to address law enforcement officer wellness and to make recommendations regarding the prevention of death by suicide of law enforcement officers. The Attorney General has already complied with this executive order, so we already know much more about the mental health resources and the needs of law enforcement. Rather than retread our steps, we should be moving forward to help our law enforcement officers implement this important work so that more officers can access the support that they need. Last Congress, under Democratic control, the House passed numerous bipartisan bills that improved law enforcement officer safety and wellness, like Protecting America's First Responders Act, the Public Safety Officer Support Act, the Confidentiality Opportunities for Peer Support, or the COPS Counseling Act, and the Law Enforcement De-Escalation Training Act. And at least 7 bipartisan law enforcement bills, many led by Republicans, have been passed by the Democratic-led Senate. These are bills that would help law enforcement and are priorities for the police groups. But so far, House Republicans have only advanced one of them. This legislation represents another wasted opportunity to work together on substantive proposals that will make our communities and the law enforcement officers that protect them safer. I urge members to oppose this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as the comments of the gentlelady from Washington developed, it became clear. She said at first, I mischaracterized what occurred in the Judiciary Committee, and then it became clear that I didn't mischaracterize anything. What they offered to do was to take, again, this bill, which provides for additional data collection about attacks on law enforcement officers, to take the entire text of the bill, to gut it, and replace it with, yes, indeed, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is the name. And that is the bill that I described as having attempted to impair officer qualified immunity, to require training on implicit bias, to establish a database to impugn officers nationwide. That is the bill that was a very top priority of Democrats when they were in the majority. It passed on the floor under their majority rule, and it went on to the Senate where it didn't advance for good reason. Because the last thing America needs, again, as demonstrated by the events in Washington, D.C., the last thing America needs is police officers to be brushed back from their jobs, to be intimidated from doing the very tough work of criminal law enforcement by legislation that antagonizes, demeans, delegitimizes them. That is the last thing that they need. And here we are. It's remarkable. Is this the only reporting bill that's ever come up that Democrats find objectionable because of their interest in good and efficient government? Is it that they're concerned about the possibility that the bill might not have excellent impacts or be efficient or advance the game or break new ground? What's the harm after all? Here's what the harm is. Democrats cannot abide even the simplest of legislation that recognizes the burdens that are borne every day by police officers across this country on our behalf, that they are being subjected to a greater and greater incidence and risk of attacks on their persons and of their deaths in the line of duty by people who intend to do them harm, and that there may be gaps in terms of the resources that are available to them to deal with the difficulties they confront. The response that you need to do the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in lieu of this reporting bill is absurd. It is gaslighting in the highest degree. This little reporting bill, there's just nothing to it. And yet, for some reason, it sticks in the craw of the minority. Just to say to police officers, we're going to extend further efforts, further minimal efforts, to learn the information that we need to find out, to see just how big this problem is, and whether you're being afforded the opportunity to deal with it in your personal lives as it wreaks havoc on them. Joshua Iyer, Sam Pelosi, Alden Elliott, Thomas Weeks Jr. One of the worst attacks on law enforcement ever. Shouldn't we go and find out what we need to know for their benefit? Is that not an appropriate way, that little bill? Would that not be an appropriate way to honor their memory? Is the concern with efficiency and breaking new ground so profound that you've got to replace the bill to find out information about the assaults on them with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was rejected last Congress? It's simply astonishing. And Americans aren't going to tolerate it. I reserve.
And reserves.
I reserve.
The gentleman from New York is recognized, Mr. Naylor.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York will now control the minority time. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me speak more directly to the circumstances in Washington, D.C., and what has transpired in consequence of exactly the kind of policing bill represented by the, quote, George Floyd Justice and Policing Act with which the minority proposed in the Judiciary Committee to gut and replace this bill. Yes, and at this time I'd yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
I thank my colleague. Madam Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, do you know why our Democrat colleagues oppose this report? Do you know why? Madam Speaker, they don't want clear, fresh, precise data provided to the American people on how many attacks uniformed law officers suffer every year. They don't want America to know, Madam Speaker, because America would be shocked. It's vastly underreported by rank and file officers like me and my brothers and sisters from sea to shining sea. Men who know what it is, not just to wear a little pin like here, we can walk around D.C. with your head high, but to wear a shield, to wear a badge, to earn that certification every year. We know what it is to be constantly under threat of attack and physical attack, but we carry on. We rarely report Well, we don't absolutely have to, because of the agenda-driven persecution that officers are currently facing in where? Republican-run cities with Republican district attorneys that actually prosecute criminals? No, Madam Speaker. In liberal cities, look at the maps. In cities run by Democrat policies and their agendas, their Democrat mayors and their Democrat DAs, those are the cities that are eaten alive by crime in America. This is why you cannot fill the ranks of law enforcement officers across the country. When I was a cop, we had about 800,000 uniformed officers. We were on our way to 1 million. We're down to about 600,000 now. Your officers are leaving service, not because of the threats that we have historically faced, but because of the threats that we continue to face from physical danger on the streets and the very significant possibility, even probability in some municipalities that the actions of that law enforcement officer are going to be treated more harshly than the criminal and violent attacks that that officer both faces and protects his community from. To think that my colleagues across the aisle would oppose a bill that mandates the Department of Justice provide accurate data to the American people about how many violent attacks uniformed officers face across the country, my God, you can barely get your head wrapped around that. Of course, this body that is supposed to represent we the people should endeavor to provide the American people with accurate contemporary data regarding such things. I'm honored to support my colleague's bill, and I encourage representatives on both sides of the aisle to join us in support of this legislation. I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think it bears repeating in light of that extraordinary commentary that right here in the District of Columbia, or to the affliction of 700,000 roughly local citizens and the 19 million that visit annually, exactly the kind of radical politicization that would say this reporting bill is beyond the pale and that you've got to have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That's exactly what they did in D.C. That's exactly what they've done to lead to citizen-led recall petitions by two D.C. council members. What they've done to see carjackings explode in ways that no one ever thought possible. To have a 20-year record of homicides last year. And to have one D.C. council member still touting that he managed, because of the budget politics, to take millions and millions out of the Metropolitan Police Department, so that their force has declined from 4,000 by 600 or more, and continues to decline 3 years into the phenomenon. How far will ideology go to take us beyond common sense to a point we can't recover? Let's do a little reporting bill and find out the details. Get a rich data set about this scourge that we see across the nation, precipitated and encouraged by those who still cannot bring themselves to say that law enforcement officers are a needed quantity. The nation must have them. Law and order must prevail in order for the country to succeed. How could we have come to a point in the country where that cannot be conceded readily by everyone in the political spectrum? I do not know. I do not understand. But that's where we are. I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves.
Prepared to close.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself balance of my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill is more cheap talk from Republicans. Nothing in this bill makes a single officer safer or invests a single dollar in officer wellness. This legislation falls far short of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would invest in better data collection and reporting by requiring law enforcement agencies to report uses of force by or against law enforcement officers as a condition of the receipt of certain grants. House Republicans are again refusing to work with police and the organizations that represent the police to pass meaningful legislation. This legislation is a missed opportunity. It calls for a report that duplicates existing reporting requirements. It falls far short of meaningful progress on officer safety, and it represents an enormous step backwards from legislation offered by the Democratic majority in the 117th Congress. I urge my colleagues to reject this legislation so that we can work together on bipartisan legislation that will really enhance the safety of our officers and our communities. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Cheap talk. That's what the gentleman from New York just said. Cheap talk. Well, Madam Speaker, there's nothing cheap about it. Behold the price. That's why when this body, when this Republican House undertook to disapprove the D.C. crime bill that would have radically rewritten criminal law in the District of Columbia, this body disapproved it with the support of over 30 Democrats. That's why Chuck Schumer and the Democrats' majority in the Senate joined in disapproving that radical rewrite of the criminal law in the District of Columbia. That's why Joe Biden signed the law to disapprove the radical rewrite of the criminal law in D.C. What's cheap talk is the concern that this would produce a duplicate report. That's the objection? That the report might be duplicative? Really? I'd say duplicative reports from here till kingdom come, if there's the slightest chance that it will avoid this unspeakable price. Everybody in the chamber should support the bill. I yield back.